Hello, my name is Tom Burby, and I'm a graduate of the Master's in Education Distance program from the University of New England. I've been asked to prepare a presentation for you about my CAR project, the project that my team and I put together so that I could complete my Master's Education degree in Science at UNE. I hope that what you find here will be useful to you. I've found that this project is the culmination of everything that I learned prior to this point. See in my presentation will be extra. It wasn't necessarily part of the program that we were supposed to finish. It wasn't part of the recipe for a collaborative action research project. Although every one of you is probably going to have to do a literature review, it's not essential that you include the literature review in your final product. We did, but we abridged it quite a bit. We felt that the literature was important in that it shed light upon the findings. My teammates and I put this together over the course of about a year, and it took us most of an academic school year to gather the data and then to interpret it. And it really did require the permission of some people in my district, like the principal of our school, our director of curriculum, and also our literacy specialist. They all kind of had to give me the green light. But they were interested too. And so I hope that you find this interesting. I hope it's enlightening for you. And I hope you're not too scared about doing a collaborative action research project. In fact, after having done this one, I can't imagine not wanting to continue it and to do others, because the best part of this was actually coming up with the questions. When my team and I were asked to come up with a question in which to investigate for our collaborative action research project, the first thing I had to do was determine what would be of value, what am I interested in? And I'm a 7th grade language arts teacher in the state of Maine, constantly sending my kids to the 8th grade and having their writing evaluated on the Maine Educational Assessment Test. And I'm also a teacher who has had laptops in his classroom for the past 5 years. And so I was very interested to see if the advent of word processors would really have any impact upon the quality of student writing. And so the problem we came up with, we entitled Word Processed versus Traditional Composition, which produces higher assessment scores in the classroom. The issue at hand was that in our district, 70% of our students are expected to meet or exceed the standard on the Maine Educational Assessment Writing Test. And in classrooms, all of our students have access to one-on-one Apple iBook computers. And they're often using them in lieu of handwriting their assignments and for other tasks. And so the question we came up with, and this was our overarching question, will the use of word processors on local area and classroom assessments result in a higher number of students whose scores meet the standard on a district-developed rubric? Currently, the MEA, Maine Educational Assessment Test, is asking for a voluntary participation in their online version of the test. It's a limited time offer, however. We know that within a year or two, the state of Maine Department of Education is going to be telling us that we're going to have to use the online version of their browser-embedded word processor for the students to do their writing test. This is once they get all the bugs worked out of it, and they've had about 4 years. So we knew that very soon we are going to be asked, actually told, to have our writing composed directly on a word processor. And that will eliminate the traditional handwriting method. We wanted to know, does this have implications? In other words, are students going to be writing better quality pieces of writing, or are they going to be writing longer pieces of writing? And those are the kind of questions that came to us in the formulation stage. A little background information, in case you're not from the state of Maine, or in case you're not a middle school teacher. But the MLTI stands for the Maine Learning Technology Initiative. And students in the state of Maine, 7th and 8th graders, have a fairly unique program in that every one of them is issued by the state a brand new iBook laptop computer. And nowhere else on earth do so many students have so much one-to-one access to word processors. And that seems wonderful, and initially when we were first given these machines, we felt very enlightened and we felt very privileged. But then the questions began arising. Just because we have the machines, does that mean the students are going to be producing higher quality products or simply electronic products? The popular conceptions among students is that the laptops really are a very motivational item. They want to use them. They want to have their hands on them. They also believe, by and large, as you'll see through our surveys, that word processing their writing is just faster. And students always place a great value on speed. The tools of a word processor, many of them believe, make for better writing, things like spell checker and grammar checker. And finally, overall, a lot of people, and we're kind of told this by people who are giving us the laptops, that students were going to benefit from the use of a word processor, that word process writing was going to be the savior. The literature tells a slightly different story. Because very few places have ever had a lot of 1-to-1 laptop to student ratio, there really haven't been a lot of studies in this area. We did find a few studies that have been done, and there is evidence in the research, in the literature, that word processors can both help and actually also hinder students when it comes to writing and when it comes to the quality of their writing. What we have is a new paradigm, because with the exception of the typewriter, which in fact may have more in common with the pencil than the word processor is the first definable technological tool that assists students in their writing and that really differs in so many ways from traditional pen and paper method. The first study that we looked at was the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is a rather large study, and it is the largest study we could look at. It's done by Jorge Bennett and Kaplan, and the most recent results that I looked at was the 2005 study. And we found that it was very difficult to compare the traditional pen and paper method of inputting writing over computer-assisted writing, because the traditional writing method is heavily influenced by something called fine motor control. Although typing on a computer or keyboarding also involves fine motor control issues, they're different issues. And so even students with limited fine motor control, we found, and the NAEP found, could control word processors to some degree, and to a better degree, quite often, than if they had just a pen or a pencil. The next study we looked at was done in 1993. It was an early study done by Kellogg and Mueller. And this study concluded that the use of the word processor does something pretty unique. It just restructures the writing process. It doesn't actually change much except the structure, in that the writing is done not with the pencil or pen, but with the keyboard. And the idea that you can copy and paste with the electronic word processor makes it a lot easier for the organizational structure to be changed on the fly. Whereas if you're just using a pen and a paper, it's a little difficult. You have to rewrite or actually physically cut and paste. In this study, Kellogg and Mueller's study, we found that the style of handwritten pieces, style being that part of the writing that was indicative of word choice and that was indicative of voice, was actually superior using handwritten pieces. However, they did find something quite interesting. Word processing in this early study required actually more time to finish than the traditional pen and paper method. Fluency was part of the problem because they were using a new input device. Most of the people in the early study weren't effective keyboarders, unlike the students in the 7th grade today that I teach. Another study that we did was Bridwell, Bowles, and Reinking in 1998. They did an attitudinal study, or a survey, of the impact of word processors. And since part of what we were doing was survey-based in our matrix, we decided this would be a good one for us to review and learn about. And we found in this study, done in '98, that the attitude toward writing, the attitude of the students toward the act of writing improves if they know they're going to use a word processor. And we also found out from this study that students who handwrite their pieces rather than word process them actually generate more ideas in their pre-writing than students who simply word process, because students who simply word process often don't do a lot of pre-writing. They simply open the word processor document and start typing. They don't plan it out first as often as kids who are simply handwriting it. We also found out, though, that students' attitude toward their writing didn't actually improve their final scores. We found the Bridwell, Bowles, and Reinking study very similar to the results that we received. Lothar in 2003 did a study very similar to ours, and what they did is they did kind of what we did. They measured the scoring of district-wide writing prompts using 4 dimensions: ideas and content, organization, style, and conventions. And they also used a scoring hierarchy just like ours, in that they used 4, 3, 2, and 1 point. They used mature, capable, developing, and emerging, whereas in Brewer we would use exceeds the standard, meets the standard, partially meets the standard, and does not meet. They did 397 students, and they had 26 middle school teachers involved in their study. So it was a rather large study. And their control group did the prompts all out in longhand, and then scorers were given all the prompts as word processed ones. So somebody had to actually retype all of those longhand prompts and then print them out so that they had the ability to eliminate discrimination or make it a blind comparison. And students who word processed in this study actually exceeded longhand scores by a full rubric point across all the traits. And we found here that in this case, writing with a word processor has to be positive in nature, because all of the writing traits improved overall by the use of a word processor, according to Lothar. And then we found some local studies that were actually very helpful and shed a light on the MLTI project, which was something these other projects didn't do. The Great Maid Schools project, the Piscataquis Valley High School project in 2004 from the Mitchell Institute, had a school that had one-to-one laptop access. And students in this study, in their attitudinal study, reported that their motivation to do work using laptops actually increases. They want to do their work if they know they're going to be able to use their machine. And 59% of them said that if they get to use a word processor, they're going to write more than a page. This is interesting in that it equates length with quality, and that's not what we were looking for. We were closer to the Lothar study, which asked, is quality improving, not just length? For most of the kids in this study, they said their favorite piece of software that they used most of the time was their word processor. It was the one they were most comfortable with. It was the one they pulled up to do most of their work. And then we have Harrison Smith study from the Maine Policy Research Institute, and they studied primarily special education students. And their question was, does the use of this technology, this one-to-one Apple iBook technology, have any impact on special ed students? And they found that primarily, and it really did, predominantly positive impact. Whenever these students were allowed to use the word processor, they scored higher. And students in this population tended to write longer pieces on the word processors than they did with pencil and paper. Again, we were looking at length versus quality, but there are some implications, because if you have longer pieces of writing, probably your ideas score is going to be a higher score. Probably your content score will be higher, because if it's longer, there's more content. The summary of all of our literature study was that writing with word processors is beneficial, largely because those writers who are using the computers and using the word processors perceive it as such. They believe, before they even open up the laptop, that it's going to help them, that they're going to do better because of it. And we wanted to know, do their perceptions actually match their performance? And so we started developing our experiment. and the first thing we had to do was create our matrix. We came up with 2 questions, and then we had to find data sources for each of those questions in order to back up our questions and our answers. The first one of our research questions is, will the use of word processors on local and class assessments result in higher number of students who meet the standard? And we found that there were 3 places we could find this information. We actually have a district database of writing prompt scores. We do 3 writing prompts in Brewer. And so we had those scores, and we actually had them from all the way from 4th grade up. And then we had data source number 2, which was our grade book. All of the writing that they do for us, with the exception of the writing prompt scores, go right into the grade book. And then finally, there's a larger collection, a larger mass of writing called their writing portfolios. And these writing portfolios are actually cumulative portfolios, so all of the writing that they do is put in there, and then they can actually go back to that and use that, this cumulative writing portfolio. And then our second question was, will students produce longer pieces of writing if allowed to use a word processor during an assessed composition with really the exact same data sources? What's interesting is that about halfway through our study, we realized that there was a problem with this question. And when you're doing action research, one of the things you're going to find, I think, is that there will be times where halfway through you need to reassess. You need to ask yourself if the questions you've already created actually have meaning. This one stopped having meaning for us. Well, because what this did was it equated longer pieces of writing with better pieces of writing. We really wanted to discriminate between those two and differentiate. Those are 2 different ideas. We didn't want just length. We wanted quality. The sampling size was a lot bigger than we expected. It was a total of 900 pieces of writing. When we sat down and said, gee, I think we can assess a few pieces of writing, we almost forgot that we have over 100 students in our class. And so if we were going to do 9 pieces of writing, that's 900 we had to grade. So it really took a lot of time. But the pieces that we used in our experiment were 2 area writing prompts, 3 classroom assessments in language arts, 2 classroom assessments in mathematics, 2 classroom assessments in science, and we used, even though we had over 100 students, we used a sample of 100 students because it made it a lot easier when we were looking at assessing the data to have that base 100. Even a base 112 would have made it a little harder, and we were looking for the easy way. And so, because we were already getting into, a much bigger study than we had anticipated. We were going to use our district rubric as our scoring guide, and this district rubric for Brewer basically is the Norell 6+1 writing traits rubric. And we decided, if you've never heard of that, it breaks up writing into 7. They call it 6+1 because at one point it was just 6, and then they added the 7th of presentation later, and instead of naming it 7 writing traits, they called it 6+1. But the areas and ideas and content basically talks to us about the ideas, how many new interesting ideas, factual ideas, how many pieces of information were included that support their thesis, that kind of information, and the completeness of information. And then we had organization. Is it have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Does it have a thesis? Are there supporting points? Is there a conclusion? Voice talks to us about basically how much the writer is involved in the writing. It's the human element, really. It's the part that makes it human, and it's the part that I guess is the hardest to grade. Word choice speaks for itself. Is there rich language? Is there evidence of some superior vocabulary, at least salt and peppering the piece? Sentence fluency, does it have a flow? Does it have some long sentences and some short sentences, some compound complex sentences, some compound sentences, some simple sentences? And finally, conventions, which are all the rules of writing, including capitalization, grammar, punctuation, and so on. Half of the pieces had to be double scored to ensure reliability and validity among the scorers. We do that anyway when we do the writing prompts. We get together in a large group and we put all the prompts out on the table, we hide the names of the students, and then we actually double score them all. So we were used to that. We had a population of teachers who were going to help me who actually were well trained in double scoring. And all students, every single student, had to have a minimal proficiency with the word processors and 6th grade keyboarding. So when they came to us, before they were in our study, they had to show us minimal proficiency with word processing, and they had to know how to keyboard. The first thing we did after developing the experiment and the questions and getting everything in line was we did a survey to determine some attitudinal information about the students. 60% of our students reported that they would rather word process than handwrite. And there are some reasons for that, I think, and I'll address those in a minute. But 15%, or 15 of the 100, said they preferred to handwrite their pieces. It was rather small. Portion of the population said they'd rather handwrite. 31% said they would rather handwrite their first draft than word process their second. And that one is in particular will come up later. That we think that's a very important element in the writing process and in this study. 54% indicate that they like to write in general, and about 43% really honestly believe they score higher when they word process than when they handwrite. And 45%, it's only a 2% difference, but it's about half and half. 45% report they score higher when they handwrite. So the kids are telling us that about half of them think they score higher when they word process, and the other half think they score higher when they handwrite. 71% did tell us that word processing is a lot easier than handwriting, and 34% reported to us that word processing is faster. And there's that term, faster, again. 74% report they use spell checkers and thesauri. I have to tell you, when we get to the convention scores, that's not happening. Assignments. Well, we gave a district writing prompt, scary story. That was word processed, and of course we labeled all of these. WP is word processed and HW is handwritten. We had the persuasive district writing prompt, so those are our 2 writing prompts. In science, we had 2 expository essays. Actually, one was a 5-paragraph essay on moon formation, word processed, and then there was an expository constructed response as well. Mathematics, 1 handwritten, 1 word processed, a triangle essay where they had to tell us everything they knew about triangles and educate us. And then they had to create a geometric construction on a piece of paper and then actually describe it using only words with handwritten. And then finally in language arts there were 3. And one was a descriptive narrative. We actually went to the Eastern Fine Paper Mill after it was closed, and the students got to take a tour of it. It was a big spooky building, and they came back and they wrote a descriptive narrative. And then they had to write a persuasive letter to the editor, and finally they had to write a Hercules constructed response question about the youth of Hercules. They were studying mythology. And so 2 handwritten, 1 word processed, total of 9. And I had some able assistants. Frank Page was on my team anyway. He was on my study team, but he was a science teacher in my class, in my team. Billy Ward was our reading teacher. Pam Gabe and Kathy Atwood taught math, and Mary Ellen Seymour taught special education. And they all agreed to help me with the scoring. And so I want to thank them now because it was crazy. 900 pieces of writing to score using the district prompt took a long, long, long time. And then we had to double score them. And now we get to our results. When looking at the spreadsheets that we created and the data tables, and when crunching the numbers, we found out that it was pretty much an even split. 42% of our students performed higher, by and large, overall, when handwriting their pieces. 40% performed higher, more often, when word processing. 18% of our students showed no appreciable difference at all. It really didn't matter for that 18%. Overall, they continually scored the same, no matter whatever mode of composition they were using. 43% thought they would perform higher more often when word processing. So that was interesting. 3% thought they would perform higher, and 40% did. 45% of students thought they would perform higher when handwriting, and 42% did. So the students actually had a pretty good handle as far as percentages goes, but the problem was a lot of the students who thought they were performing better handwriting didn't, and a lot of the students who thought they would perform better using word processors didn't. They weren't really good judges about that part of their attitudinal responses. An almost equal number of students do measurably better using one mode of composition over another. This is significant, and it has an impact for any writing assignments that we assign, as well as the future MEA writing prompts, which will all be done using an embedded word processor in a web browser. And so that has a direct impact, because half of those kids are going to do okay. Well, 40%, but another 42% really aren't going to do better. They would do much better if they were allowed to handwrite it. When we look at the actual comparisons, and when we break down the 6+1 writing traits, this is what we get. Now you notice we only have 6, not 6+1, because we left out the +1. We didn't do the presentation trait because we figured it would be unfair. If a student had bad handwriting, we might actually give them a lower grade, but the quality is what we were looking for, not just the presentation. And when we look at this, there are some interesting things. Overall, ideas and content scores were higher with word processed pieces, 41% to 51%, a 10% spread. That's significant. The organization was also significant in that we had 53% here and 42% here. A very large spread, 11-point difference. So we know that for ideas and content and organization, students using the word processor will generally get higher scores in these two areas. But then we get down to voice, no appreciable difference, 44 to 45%, no appreciable difference. But voice is that part of your writing that is you. It's not going to change depending on your mode, because it's your personality coming through, it's your care, it's the way in which you write. And finally we get down to some other very interesting things, because when we look at word choice, we have a huge spread. 52% of the kids did better when handwriting on word choice. Word choice talks about rich language and specific language and colorful language and appropriate language. Word choice talks to us about a vocabulary, and we wondered, why would handwritten pieces give us such a high score? More about that later, but that's significant. 52% of the kids who handwrote their pieces scored better than kids who word processed when they did word choice. And finally, sentence fluency, it's about a 5-point spread, not that significant. And with conventions though, wow. Conventions, 54% of the kids, 10-point difference, did better when handwriting. Again, conventions, that was puzzling and troubling, because conventions talk about spelling and punctuation and capitalization and paragraphing and so on. All of those things that one might assume a word processor will help them with. I'm going to go through these rather quickly with you, but you can see that ideas and content can be significantly aided by pre-writing strategies. And that talks to us about the word processor. What can you do with a word processor easily that you can't do with a piece of paper? Well, one thing you can do is you can research, and you can go back and easily insert ideas. If you look back at that first or second paragraph, you might notice there would be, maybe some left out ideas, maybe some supporting facts that you could have put in but you didn't. If you're handwriting that, that's really difficult to do, and maybe so difficult that you decide not to do it. But if you're word processing, you just simply put the cursor where it needs to be and continue typing. We know that kids who use the word processor generally get higher scores here. Organization. 53% of students perform higher more often when word processing than when handwriting. That has everything to do, I believe, with the ability to copy and paste, to move text around in large blocks, and with the fluidity that a word processor allows. It's totally not there with a piece of paper. Pieces of paper don't allow for that unless you have a some scissors and some tape and some glue, and maybe you could cut paragraphs and move them around, but other than that, it's extremely difficult, especially in a testing situation. You won't have that happening. Cut, copy, and paste options on a word processor make that process of organization something that one can do on the fly. It makes it fluid and it makes it easy, and there is no counterpart really on paper. And 71% of students report that writing on a word processor is easier for me. We got that in our attitudinal study. This may be directly related to the organization part. Voice, nearly unaffected. Didn't matter which mode they were using. And you know, there is no voice check. There's a spell check. There's a grammar check on some word processors, but there is no voice check. It's the personality of the writer coming through. Again, that's probably not going to change depending on whatever mode you're going to use. Word choice. Now, we're going into an area where students do better in handwriting than they do in word processing, because there's a 14% gain over word choice when students handwrite their writing. They have the ability, using their computers, to use online thesauri and online dictionaries. However, they don't seem to be gaining in their score area by using these things, because even though 47% of them claim to use spell checkers and thesauri on their laptops, in actuality, many of them aren't pressing the spell check button or aren't very good at using the spell check options. And the thesauri, they may not know how to use at all. More students score more highly in a trait that the computer could probably help them with a great deal. And that's interesting. We wondered why. Because they score more highly in this trait using the older, slower, but probably more comfortable, familiar mode of handwriting. Sentence fluency, there was a 5% difference. Sentence fluency is a logical flow of subject, predicate, and variations of phrasing and pacing in a piece of writing. And that difference of 5% is really very insignificant, but still slightly favors handwriting. Again, it's a slower mode of writing that requires more time, and therefore possibly more time for reflection and choice. It's not how fast when you're handwriting, it's not how fast you get it done, but it is when you're word processing. Conventions, this is the part that troubled us, because when surveyed, 45% of students felt that using the word processor would help them with that trait of conventions. But in fact, 54% of students scored higher in the trait of conventions when handwriting, even though they have spell checkers. There were no grammar checkers in this particular study because our word processors didn't have them. 45% of students score higher more often in the trait of conventions when word processing. Why? Okay, now to the why. Now to some of our conclusions. We believe it's all about perception, time, and mode. Students place a great faith in the computer's ability to think for them. They believe that these machines are going to help them in the areas of conventions, but the data does not support this. They think that this machine, this word processor, is actually going to make their writing better. That assumption does not necessarily hold out to be true. Students do believe that it's faster to compose on a word processor. And even though one of the studies we read earlier in our literature showed us that it actually took longer for some students to word process, students place great value on speed. And if they think they can get the work done a little faster, often preferring shortcuts and quick methods, they're going to place high value on that, and they're going to think that that fast method is the best method. Writing in longhand takes a lot of time. It relies on fine motor control for completion, and for some students, their handwriting just isn't very good, especially in the 7th grade when we no longer teach handwriting. It just is what it is. If your handwriting's not really good in the 7th grade, it's probably not going to get a lot better. And for students whose handwriting is bad, they're probably going to think their writing on word processor is going to be better, because it's going to look better. And longhand writing requires so much patience and forethought. It's so much easier to edit on a word processor, to move text around, to get rid of things and not have all kinds of space, not have to use whiteout, because that workspace on a word processor is fluid and ever expanding. Word processed writing looks neater and really is partially organized by the machine itself when we talk about margins and line spacing. And so again, for students whose handwriting may not be that great, they may look at their word processed writing and say, gee, I look just like everyone else. I like this better. my writing is better because it looks better on the screen. And obviously, students who have a good facility with word processing are going to have that premium skill, and students who don't, it might take them longer. One-to-one writing on a laptop is different often than working from workstations where you just don't actually have that computer all the time. You don't have that comfort level with it. And again, Maine is lucky to have that. One use of the machine in our school is highly anticipated in the 6th grade. The 6th grade teachers talk about it a lot. When they come into the 7th grade, students are given a training process. They earn their license, their internet driver's license. It's very important. We have little ceremonies to go along with it. And they probably connect this anticipation and this build-up to the power and meaning of that machine. Students often relish opportunities to use that machine. They'd rather use that than not. And some students have handwriting that they believe is unsightly or ugly, and again, the word processor all but eliminates that fear. The speed of the composition has much to do with the care one puts into that final project. The faster it's done, the faster you can go do something else. But if you have to rewrite something because that first draft is not really going to be presentable, you're going to have to take more time on that initial drafting. Handwriting does require that slower process, much slower than word processing for most students. That's what we found out. We found out that at any given time, half the kids are going to benefit over one mode over the other. And so we had to come up with an action plan. Something that we were going to do to continue this study, and something we were going to do as a result of this study, because action research has as its goal affecting the instruction in the classroom. So I had to find a way to change what we were doing. And so when we looked at this, our action plan, we decided handwriting might seem outwardly to most people to be less effective than word processing on a computer, but we knew that at least half the class is going to benefit whenever we use one mode over another. And we knew that a lot of teachers were totally abandoning, or nearly abandoning, the longhand method in favor of word processing, because the word processing in our school could easily be emailed or easily put into a Dropbox, and it was so much easier for that teacher to take home a laptop with all the electronic files rather than pieces of paper. And we wondered, maybe we shouldn't abandon handwriting in favor of word processing, that is not a good idea. Each mode of composition that we use is important to developing writers, but one isn't inherently better than another. It all depends on the student and what their strengths are. Students really should use each mode equally over the course of a year, over the course of a class, so that they could strengthen their weakest mode at least half the time. They're exercising. And all writing assignments that we give, we found we probably did not give enough time on. And no, we didn't ask students about that, but I know now that students probably would tell me they all needed more time, that they felt rushed. We thought too that the database that we created to collect all of this differentiated data on the writing traits was extremely important, because when we were all done with this, I could actually tell the teacher in the 8th grade who I was sending my students to which students performed better under which mode. And not only that, that database could be prescriptive. I could give this teacher, and I did, give him the database to determine which students need instruction in which area. In other words, I'm sharing my grade book. I'm specifically sharing just these assignments though, because I'm not in this isolated and alone. We teach writing all the way through K-12. This kind of data needs to come up to me. Not to hurt the child's grade, but just to help me as a professional know which areas the students need extra help on. And also, we need to educate our students about the difference between those two modes and about their perceptions about them, and how they perhaps might be wrong, and how they perhaps might be right. They obviously should be knowledgeable about which mode works best for them, and they should know which traits they're good at and which traits they need work on. So just like an athlete, they can strengthen those areas or those muscles that need strengthening. we decided that there were a couple of things we could do in practice actually in the classroom. We could actually have students handwrite their first drafts and then word process their second drafts as a forced revision. That would require them to do that second draft. We thought that would be a good idea because then students could move organization around. They could take their content and shift where it appeared. They could reorganize their data. They could reorganize their writing. But then we thought something rather different. We had never heard of this before. To word process their first drafts, which would mean changing the organization, moving blocks of text around, researching, getting all of the positive they can from that word processor, and then handwriting their second drafts as a forced revision, forcing them to consider every single word that they put down, forcing them to look at all of the capitalization and punctuation, forcing them to look at word choice. Our action plan culminates with the idea that the ways we can have students write in the classroom to prompts and to constructed responses and just to any pieces of writing might seem contrary to logic. It might seem contrary to have a child word process their first draft and handwrite their second draft, or it might seem contrary equally to have them handwrite their first draft and word process their second draft. But depending on the preference and strength of each writer, it might be possible to just slow down that process of writing a little bit. That way they could produce more carefully orchestrated pieces, and that's what we're looking for, because we're looking for quality, not quantity. And finally, we'd like to collect and analyze data on this issue for the next couple of years, because unlike the big studies that you'll see in publications like the ASCD, action research, classroom action research is important, but it seems to be only important in this room at this time with this group of students. And so we wanted to know, is this information that we're getting, is it going to be something that we can use to predict the performance in years to come to brand new groups of students? Is it something that we can use to help them in the future? So we need to get more information. We need to continue our action research project for the next 2 years at least, so that we can actually have a larger sampling of students. And the more we have, the better. And hopefully we'll have the same teachers who are doing the same double scoring, so even that remains reliable and valid. Our conclusions: word processors are everywhere. They're ubiquitous. They're even on the students' cell phones now. Witness texting anytime you get a chance. They are a fact of life. Word processors are everywhere. Handwriting, old-fashioned as it is, offers the promise of better word choice, more considered thought, and rich poetic language. And it is less mechanical in nature and possibly more artistic, because handwriting is a fine motor control issue. It is definitely, though, something that we know will help students in at least 2 areas. And students need to use both modes often, because they will need to be proficient in both modes in the world. They're not going to have to just use a word processor wherever they go. There are going to be many times, witness a job application, where they're going to have to write it out in longhand, or even a college application where they're going to have to write it out in longhand. And so longhand writing does matter. They need to be able to use both modes. And depending on which mode they use, each child will do better in certain areas of the 6+1 writing traits. What was frustrating about doing the action research project was that presenting it sometimes seems a little dry, but for those of us involved in the process, we were very excited by what we found. Not many people probably would be unless they taught writing. The whole idea of action research gave us the opportunity to be powerful in a field where we weren't before. Because before, we were simply told what to do. We were told, hey, your scores are low in these 2 areas, do something about it. And we really didn't get much more help than that. Usually our literacy specialist would come in, or perhaps our director of instruction would come in, and we've had conversations. We might go to certain seminars or get some extra training. We might pull kids aside and give them help in general. But now, with this information, we have very specific targeted information that we can use to assist students in particular areas of the writing rubric. And so that overall, not just 70% can meet the standard, but hopefully more than that. And we can have some kids who actually exceed. Currently, in the class we had, we were looking for 70% to meet the standard, and actually 70% did meet the standard. That may have been because we gave them a whole lot of practice in writing that was assessed, double scored, using that rubric. It was usually a little more than we were used to doing. Quite often, when I got a piece of writing, we would just record their scores in certain particular areas, not holistically, so that a student might give me a piece of writing and get a convention score, one piece of writing, the next piece they might get a voice score, and the next piece they might get an ideas and content score. Well, this year, because we did the project, we had holistic scores most of the time, and it really was helpful, I think, to the kids because it gave them a much bigger picture. It gave them a highly focused image of who they were as writers by the end of the year, which was something that was important. And maybe the most important part of this whole project was that this database we made needs to continue to be made. And we need to continue to use this process to help us determine how to best help the kids. And when all is said and done, the Action Research Project probably was the best thing I did for the entire experience I had at UNE, because it actually brought me closer to my team of teachers. It gave me more information about my students, and it gave me information I could use. I did an awful lot of reading and I did an awful lot of research, but by the end of the process, I not only was a better teacher, but I really felt like I was empowered like I hadn't been before. And it wasn't an empowerment that my principal could give me, and it wasn't an empowerment that I could just say, oh, I feel, you know, like I'm in charge now. I really was far more knowledgeable about my students and their strengths and weaknesses. And I wouldn't have had that had I not taken the time to come up with, well, a question that had direct impact upon each and every one of my kids. Thank you for watching.